If you were a British subject in the 1600s or 1700s, you could be surrounded by a group of Navy recruiters and be forced to serve on a warship, basically abducted from your everyday life by a group of thugs and forced to serve in terrible conditions on board a wooden sailing ship, and as a bonus with a decent possibility of death. You could be just going about your everyday normal life and bam, welcome to the Navy. So how and why did the Royal Navy resort to this awful practice? Well, sailing warships required a vast number of people to operate properly. Sailors tended to prefer to serve in the British merchant fleet, which not only paid more, but also tended to have a little less chance of death or horrible injury in wartime. The Royal Navy had to come up with this deficit of men from somewhere, and the practice of using press gangs to force men into the Navy began in the 1200s, but the practice is most well known from the 17th and 18th centuries. The Royal Navy preferred to operate using volunteers, but when the supply of volunteers ran out, which happened quite frequently in times of war, the press gangs would be out on the street looking for victims. The press gangs would try to find men with seafaring experience to kidnap into service. They would go through towns and look for men with any telltale signs of ship experience. A lot of these signs would be simple things, like wearing a checkered shirt, wide-kneed trousers, or a round hat. Another dead giveaway was if your hands were tar-stained. Tar was used on ships to make materials water-resistant, and sailors were well known at the time by their tar-covered hands. Besides going through towns and looking for victims, press gangs would also go out in boats near ports and intercept incoming merchant ships. The goal here would be to seize merchant sailors directly off their ships. Imagine you're a sailor on one of these merchant ships. Maybe you've been gone for months and months on a long voyage, and just as you're finally about to get home and see your family and friends, you're abducted and forced into the Royal Navy to serve for years, and possibly die. To prevent sailors from escaping, once the press gangs had rounded them up, they moved the sailors to small ships called tenders, which were effectively floating jails, to wait to be moved to the ship on which the sailors would serve. These tenders had their hatchways bolted shut, and had armed marines guarding the prisoners, sailors, as they waited. Even after these abducted sailors were finally moved to the Royal Navy ship on which they'd serve, sometimes certain precautions had to be made. For instance, Royal Navy ships with pressed sailors on board would sometimes moor far away from land while in a British harbor to prevent their pressed sailors from trying to swim to land and desert. During the Battle of Trafalgar, which occurred in 1805, about 115,000 of the Royal Navy sailors were impressed men, and by the time of the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, as much as 75% of the Navy was made up of these abducted sailors. Britain also ran into a little bit of trouble when they took the liberty of using impressment on sailors from other countries. During the Napoleonic Wars between 1793 and 1812, the British impressed more than 15,000 American sailors into the Royal Navy. The US wasn't a big fan of this, and the practice led to consequences for Britain. The United States declared war on them in 1812, partly due to this practice. One popular myth from the time of press gangs is that a recruiting sergeant would wait in bars and drop a shilling into the drinks of unsuspecting men when they weren't looking. And when the drinkers got to the end of the tankard, they would see that they had accepted the king's shilling, which meant that they had been recruited. Thus, the invention of tankards with clear bottoms, so that men could see that there was a shilling in the bottom. But this notion is likely a myth. Press gangs could simply use force and violence to impress men. They didn't need to resort to this kind of trickery. After the Napoleonic War, the practice of using press gangs to abduct sailors fell out of use. I, for one, am really glad to live in a time and place where this sort of forced military service isn't required. If you like this video, you should go ahead and like and subscribe. There's going to be lots more awesome topics coming up, and you're not going to want to miss them. And while I have you here, why not check out these other videos on some pretty cool topics as well? Anyway guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.